Hello, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I am the host of Reformed GGA, and today we're going to be taking another look at the KS-47 by Palmetto State Armory. This little beastie right here. And those of you guys who have followed the channel know that it's kind of an unusual choice for me, and that I and PSA don't get along particularly well right now, and most of that has to do with the fact that every single gun that I've bought from them that they designed, that's their baby, as it were, that's their manufacture, and they're the ones that actually made it. Every one of those kinds of guns that I bought from them has had problems of one kind or another. Some much more severe problems, some fairly minor, to be fair, but they've all had problems. And so my opinion of PSA is not particularly high. However, there were some recent events, of which I'm sure you guys are all pretty well aware, but there was at least one major recent event that led me to basically kind of reconsider what I had, and the gun that actually wound up being the best choice given the options available to me for my traveling bedside gun actually wound up being the KS-47 with a 16-inch barrel on it, and this is just a Magpul stock, but a great many other stocks would work just fine for my purposes, but it wound up being this thing right here. And the event that led to that, as you guys probably have already guessed, is the ATF's new final rule on pistol braces. Yeah, because of that rule, and because of the fact that if I do want to, get in a legal battle with the ATF, I want to do it on my time and at a point of my choosing. What I'm going to be carrying with me for my regular bedside gun, I don't want it to be something that isn't, that is going to basically wind up risking an altercation with the ATF at any given moment. I don't want to put that in their court, I want that to be in my court. So I try to make sure that what I have is in compliance with the laws of the areas that I go to, and would suggest that people, in so much as it doesn't compromise your values, actually do their best to actually comply with the laws in their various jurisdictions that they're in. Like I said, there is definitely a time and place to fight the ATF on these issues, but it's always a wise idea to, pick that fight at a time of your choosing, not their choosing. And so, in so much as it depends on you, have stuff at your disposal that is not going to get you thrown in the gulag immediately. Like I said, there is a time and a place for that fight, but you probably don't want it to be, if you're in my case, if you're in my situation, when you're out trying to do a normal business trip. When you're out doing a business trip, you probably want to be doing that business and not, getting involved with the ATF and all that kind of thing. So, you want to be able to pick and choose, and I'm no different in that regard from, most people that are out there. Like I said, what you choose to do between you and the ATF is entirely up to you, but, the reality is that most of us want to pick and choose that moment. And so that's the spot that I was in as well. As a lot of you guys know, that pistol case, it's right over there, you can just see it in the bottom corner of the screen there. That pistol case is usually what I carry my bedside self-defense weapon in. And up till now, that has basically been the requirements as to how that has gone. And for the longest time, the gun that I kept coming back to that fit in that case, that seemed to work the best, was the CZ Scorpion Evo 3. It was a sufficiently reliable design, it worked well with a lot of defensive ammo, and there was a wide array of very good magazines that were on the market for it. It just worked, and it was the right size, and it was reliable, and did everything that I wanted it to do, pretty much. But with this new rule from the ATF coming down, and like I said, there are definitely going to be various legal contests to that, and we might not see the end result of all of that for maybe a couple of more years. But like I said, until all that gets figured out, I needed something, you know, that would at least be compliant. And the problem is, excuse me, the problem is that anything that would be compliant in terms of having a bedside gun that was actually properly a rifle, any proper rifle that I could think of, the vast majority of them at least, would not fit in that space. Now, there are a few exceptions that are worth noting. One of the first ones that comes to mind, of course, is the Kel-Tec Sub 2000. That would definitely fit in the allotted space, that's true. But the Kel-Tec Sub 2000 does have some disadvantages. One is that the range of ammunition that I can use with it is not quite as wide as the CZ Scorpion was. In particular, the Sub 2000 that I tested a while back, well, not that I tested it, it was actually somebody else's, and I just kind of watched them use it, and that person who was using it discovered that it didn't like flat nose rounds very well. So like a lot of the 147 grain stuff has a flat nose on it, it didn't like that kind of stuff, and certain hollow points, it actually ran a decent number of hollow points, but there are certain hollow points that it didn't like as well. So a little bit more limited on what could be put in it, but it still wasn't bad. Major disadvantage there is that if I went with that, I would have to buy a brand new gun, and that means a whole brand new background check, and of course there's costs associated with the new gun, and most of them are not horribly expensive, but for a decent Sub 2000 with the right kind of magazine configuration and all that I would like, I'm looking at least $450 for the gun. Now, there are rebates that are available, and sometimes there's good sales, etc., but a lot of them are around 450 bucks, at least at the time that I was looking into this. So that is technically an option that would work. Smith & Wesson basically came out with their version of the Sub 2000, and it's substantially more expensive. I think the last time that I saw it, it was like high 600s, low 700s, somewhere in that price range for basically the same kind of functionality, except that theirs was thicker because it folds on the side instead of over the top, which is better for mounting optics, but a little bit worse in terms of trying to fit into a really small, thin case. But that was an option as well. If you wanted something that was still technically legally a rifle, would fit in the pistol case, those were some options. But like I said, both of those, you know, you're looking at, you know, $400, $450 plus. In the case of the Smith & Wesson version, you know, like $600, $700 some odd dollars, and both of them require a background check. So I wasn't super keen on that option. And if I'm going to be required to do something with a full 16-inch barrel, you know, why not actually pick something that is really, truly powerful in terms of that barrel length? If you're going to have to be stuck with full rifle size, why not have full rifle power? And in that sense, you know, the Sub 2000 and the Smith & Wesson option really don't make a whole lot of sense in that regard. If you have to be dealing with this thing that's extra long, you know, when you're, you know, alone at night in the hotel room, if you're going to deal with the extra length, to a certain extent the weight, but mostly the added length was the concern, you might as well just go for an actual rifle round. And so in terms of guns that I already had that would still be small enough to break down and fit into a suitcase well, the KS-47 actually turned out to be the best option. In terms of upgrading it, getting the major part that I needed, of course, would basically be a new upper. Technically, I didn't need the whole new upper, but about a whole new upper anyways. But that was around 450 bucks. So basically the same cost as getting a new gun that would be compliant, but had the advantage of being substantially more powerful because uses 7.62 by 39 ammunition, and on top of that, and not only more powerful, it is compliant, still fits in the case well, and of course doesn't require a separate background check because you're technically using the same gun, you just put a different barrel on it. So that is why I wound up going with the KS-47 that you see here. when I break it down, there are some parts that will fit in the case, but the rather long rifle barrel, that does not, and so that gets stowed separately. But of course, the part that is legally the gun gets locked up in the case, and so I'm still doing my job in terms of preventing, or taking steps, I should say, not truly preventing, because people are going to do what they want to do, but taking steps to make it not so easy for would-be criminals. That is, I've made due steps towards safe storage and transport and those kinds of things. The main part of the gun gets locked up separately. Of course, it's unloaded. Like I said, all the safe storage laws are complied with, all that kind of stuff. But the rifle barrel, I should say, does have to be stored separately now. But like I said, in terms of being able to fit it all in the suitcase and lock up as much of it as I could, like I said, this wound up being the best option that didn't require a separate background check, and it was something that I already had in inventory. So that's how I wound up with the rifle version of the KS-47. Now, how did it perform? I'm just going to go through it basically like I would any other gun, and as we go through, I'll mention some of the parts that of course came from the old KS-47 and lessons that I learned when it was in its pistol configuration. But just starting with the barrel here, nothing too out of the ordinary. The muzzle device that is on the end, of course, has the enclosed bottom, kind of the A2 birdcage thing going on, although of course it's a 7.62 by 39 gun, so it's not technically an A2 birdcage because that's a 5.56 thing, but it's the same basic concept. And it's not a terrible flash hider, not a terrible compensator, but it's really nothing special. I don't particularly notice it or not notice it. It's just kind of their kind of average, you know, kind of typical AR stuff. It doesn't really feel all that different. And then the handguard that PSA puts on these things is actually a pretty decent handguard. It's nice and slim. Have a little bit of pick rail on the top. If you want to do an open folding sight, that would be a good point for that. Has a little bit of rail also towards the tail end here, and that's mostly so that you could add things like IR designators and a few other things, you know, lights and lasers and that kind of thing, although I don't know if I'd want to mount all of it right there. And then of course it has, you know, M-lock basically all the way around. Use a little bit to put on pick rail for my weapon light when I have it on there. And this handguard is actually attached pretty well, and I will have to admit that on the pistol version of the KS-47 that I used to have, that it was actually mounted up fairly well too. And PSA kind of has a reputation for not always putting their handguards on their ARs properly, but out of all the things that have gone wrong with PSA guns, that actually is not one that I have experienced. In my experience, the handguards on these KS-47s have actually been just fine. And granted, that's only a sample of two, the pistol that I used to have and now the rifle length version. But they're solid, they haven't come loose, they're just fine, and they actually have little locking tabs on the handguard that help keep them oriented. And they do use the actual red Loctite on the screws that attach it to the, well, I don't think it's directly on the barrel, but on the barrel nut. So it's a good solid lockup, and like I said, it's nice and thin, so you can do, you know, a proper C-clamp on it. The barrel itself is rather beefy. On the website, it said that this was a medium profile barrel, and I would not call that a medium profile barrel. That is rather substantial. I mean, I have AKs that are in the same caliber, 7.62 by 39, and those are definitely lightweight barrels. I have a Galil that's in 308, and it's of course has a thicker barrel than most of my other AKs, and I would call that one a medium profile barrel. It's, you know, 7.62 by 51. There's not a whole lot of difference in terms of internal diameter between a 308 barrel and a 7.62 by 39 barrel. There is a difference, but I'm not saying that there isn't. There is a difference, but it's just for our purposes here, it's not a very substantial difference. And compared to all of my other nominally 7.62 barrels that I have, this is easily the thickest one. So even though PSA calls this a medium profile barrel, I'm going to go ahead and call that a heavy profile barrel. And it does have the weight to go along with it. It's not terrible. But yeah, the front end for an AR type gun is a little on the heavy side. It's not bad, especially considering that, you know, you're firing 7.62 by 39 out of it. It's not a very bad idea to have a little bit thicker barrel to help compensate for some of the natural inconsistencies in the ammunition. Most of the ammunition that's out there for 7.62 by 39 is not super consistent, and so guns that are in 7.62 by 39 don't tend to be super accurate. Like most AKs usually are somewhere in the 3 to 4 MOA range in terms of accuracy. Having the extra barrel thickness on there kind of helps change some of those barrel harmonics and produces a little bit better consistency. In my experience so far, I haven't done any real precise group testing, but normally what it appears to be so far, I'll update you guys if it changes. But right now this one looks to be about a 2 to 3 MOA gun with most ammunition. So it's a little bit better than most AKs are with the same ammo, but not by a huge degree. We're talking, you know, a 1 MOA difference, and that can be important in some cases, but it's not a miracle worker. It doesn't take that ammo and turn it into a half MOA gun. It's, you know, it's not going to take 7.62 by 39 and turn that into a sniper cartridge. It really isn't. So you do get a little bit of accuracy with having that thicker profile barrel, but it's not going to work miracles. If you have inconsistent ammo, you have inconsistent ammo. You know, if you want an accurate gun, you need accurate ammo. And while a bulk 7.62 by 39 is not accurate ammo, okay? So just be realistic about that if you decide to go this way. All right, and then going back from there, I of course did what I usually do. Now that I have two, I can say this is my standard practice. Yes. Yeah, but still my standard practice on AR guns in general, at least that are, you know, actually rifle caliber, I went ahead and put a Devil Dog's hard charger on the weapon, and this is the forward mounted version of the hard charger, which means they actually have to file a little bit on the back end where it connects with the gun. Excuse me. Have to file a little bit on the back end where it connects with the gun in order to get it to fit properly. Devil Dogs now makes a hard charger version that connects on the rear of the flat top upper that doesn't require any additional filing or anything like that. So if you guys, you know, don't want to have to do that extra work, but you still want that hard charger, I love that thing. That is an option for you, going with the rear mounted one instead of the forward mounted one. I went with the forward mounted one just because that's what I was used to from the pistol version, and so I did the exact same thing. And I really do actually recommend having some kind of a side charging system on the KS-47, and that is because this gun has no last round bolt hold open because it uses AK magazines. And by the way, this gun has already been checked and cleared off camera. Yeah, completely empty. But it uses AK magazines, and of course AK magazines normally don't have any provision for holding the bolt open. There is an exception with the so-called Yugo-style magazines, the Zastava-style magazines. They have a heightened follower that can stop the bolt, but it doesn't necessarily work in all guns. I've tried their magazines in my AKs and didn't actually work in my AKs, and it doesn't really seem to work very well in this particular KS-47 either. I don't know if that's just unique to this one or if that's a problem with all KS-47s. But yeah, the Yugo-style bolt hold open is a thing that is out there that can be helpful. It doesn't stay locked back, though, you need to understand it's the follower that's holding the bolts, and so it allows you to, you know, check the chamber pretty easily and confirm that you're empty. But as soon as you take the magazine out, the bolt will go home, and so it doesn't actually truly hold it open for you. It just allows you to check your chamber once the magazine is empty. That's all that it really does for you. It's not a bad thing that it does that, of course, but it doesn't work like a true last round bolt hold open does, and like I said, it doesn't work in this particular gun, at least as far as I know. Maybe I just got a bad Zastava magazine and need to test with another one, I don't know, but in my experience, those have not worked with the PSA guns. Of course, the point on the KS-47 is that it takes the AK magazines, and if you're used to running AKs, you're used to not having a last round bolt hold open, and that's not going to bug you too much. Except on these, of course, you have that rear charging handle for a typical AR, and the spring that they put in here is actually a 308 spring, not a typical AR-15 spring, not a typical 5.56 spring, and so it's pretty substantial to try to pull against. And if you're like me and you put an optic on the back end, it's going to be kind of hard to get to that charging handle. And there are charging handles out there that will fit in these things because it's a standard AR-15 length, so it will use standard AR-15 charging handles. And so there's charging handles out there that are a little bit longer on either end that you could use to get around the optic problem. But given that it's a little bit harder to push, given that it doesn't have a last round bolt hold open, at least not a true one, I always opt for the side charger system. That's what I prefer. That is my personal preference. And then going back from there, we of course have the optic arrangements. I have a primary arms 3X Microprism on here, and so far I actually like it quite a bit. It is kind of a small reticle, but it's not nearly as small as the 2X reticle was. Primary Arms came out with a 2X prism scope that was pretty decent, but the reticle in it, at least for me, was rather small for both the 7.62x39 and the 5.56. The 9mm reticle actually was big enough for me to work with well, but of course it was designed for 9mm, not rifle caliber. This one, of course, has a little bit better magnification than that, and it's also a very small package. The optic itself only weighs like 8 ounces, and of course the mount does add a few ounces to that. There's different mounting options, so it will kind of vary in terms of what weight you add on for that part of it. But it's a relatively lightweight optic. It does have magnification. It's 3X. It does have bullet drop compensators in the reticle. It has an edged reticle. So it's actually, in my experience so far, a pretty decent little optic, and I've been pretty impressed with that. And that's my primary kind of sort of distance optic. 7.62x39, you don't really expect to be a super long range round. I know inside of 200 yards, there's really nothing bad about 7.62x39. Usually inside of 200, it's just fine. You start getting out to 300 and you start noticing some problems with wind drift, especially here in southern Idaho. We definitely have some problems with wind drift. And then once you start getting past 500, then you're into the transonic zone for a lot of 7.62x39. Depends on the particular round, depends on the barrel length. But usually past 500 somewhere, a lot of times around 550, you go through the transonic zone and you got a round that already has some problems with wind. Going transonic, it really gets disturbed, and getting hits past 500 yards with 7.62x39 is very, very, very difficult. But if we're talking about, man-sized silhouettes, yeah, out to 500 is possible, especially if it's a relatively calm day. 300 is where most people are going to struggle with it. But inside of 200 yards, there's really nothing all that special about it. And a lot of people, including myself, just zero the guns for 200 yards and really don't worry about, any of the holdovers or whatever that can be built into the optic. It's just, they don't really intend to use it past that distance. And for that application, it works fine. But this one I actually am trying to get set up so that I can use it at further distances. And I went and got it roughly zeroed at 50 yards, but a group of cows that came through the shooting area kind of prevented me from getting my long distance shots to actually confirm it out at like 300 or 400 or something like that. Well, actually, at that range, I'd only have about 300 yards. Well, 350 technically, but about 300 yards functional range to work with. But I didn't true it out at distance, so I need to do that sometime. So the prism optic is there, and it's also a shake awake, so you can illuminate it, and you don't really have to worry about killing the battery when you turn the illumination on, because it's a shake awake. You leave it alone for a couple of minutes, it turns itself off. Well, like usually 2 to 10 minutes, depending on the particular brand and model. With most shake awakes, that's how it is. And a lot of those you can actually set for different time intervals. But yeah, shake awake, so you can have the optic on, as it were, but it won't, you know, drain the battery too bad. And of course, it's an etched reticle, so you can use it without the illumination as well, because it's actually cut into the glass, so that's not going to go anywhere. And then that is augmented by this little red dot that is on an offset mount, and that is basically meant to take up the close-in stuff. And it works like pretty much any standard red dot does. This is, of course, meant to take one of the pistol red dots or reflex sight. I decided to go with the Holosun 407 because it's a relatively inexpensive optic, and it actually holds up real well, and it actually works pretty consistently. If you have to do things on a budget, and suddenly, because the government decided to suddenly change their mind, you know, cheap and effective is probably what you're going to wind up going with, and that's what I did. And this one I have set at 25 yards, and it works just fine at that distance, does exactly what it's supposed to do. I will say that when you're using the offset, of course your shoulder hold, locking into your shoulder, is going to be a little bit off. And of course it's 7.62 by 39, so it packs a little bit more of a punch than 5.56 does. That's what most people would be used to with their ARs, and 5.56 does not have much recoil at all. It's a fairly loud cartridge because it's a very high pressure cartridge, but it doesn't have a whole lot of recoil. And most of that is because it uses a very light projectile, you know, 55 grains, 62 grains, maybe 69, maybe 77, but you usually don't get any heavier than that in 5.56 guns. 7.62 by 39 usually starts at 122 grains and goes up to like 154, at least for standard ammunition. I might have seen some that went pretty close to 200 or over, but those would be like special subsonic rounds and those kinds of things. As far as standard hypersonic, well, hypersonic is maybe not a good term for that, because 7.62 by 39 rounds don't actually go all that super fast, but they usually are supersonic at least. For the supersonic rounds, it's usually 122 grains to 154 grains. That's quite a bit more than 5.56 projectiles are, and so there is quite a bit more felt recoil. And so if you're using the offset, you are going to notice that a little bit more, just because the end of the stock isn't, you know, oriented in the same way, so there's going to be a little bit more pressure. So just be aware of that. But other than that, it is a system that works quite well. The height over bore for each optic is basically the same, so I don't have to worry about, you know, crazy offsets when I'm close or super far out or anything like that. It's basically just standard AR compensation through and through, with it, of course, being 7.62 by 39 instead of 5.56. Aside from that detail, everything else basically works exactly like a standard AR does. So that part is nice. And then we get into the parts that are pretty much the same as on the old gun, except, of course, for the stock. The stock I did get, of course, not from the old version, because the old version was the pistol, and so it had the pistol brace. But I decided to go ahead and get a proper stock on it, and thought I would give the CTR stock from Magpul another go. Those of you who followed the channel, you know that I tried one of these stocks on my Galil, and it turned out that the Galil extension and the CTR stock were not actually properly sized for the CTR function to actually function. For those of you who don't know, the Magpul CTR stock is supposed to be such that this little locking clasp here at the front is actually supposed to lock the stock down so that it doesn't wiggle, but as you can hear, it still wiggles. So yeah, the Magpul CTR stock I'm pretty much convinced is useless at this point, because I've now tried it on 2 guns that were supposed to be, you know, mil-spec tubes with mil-spec CTR stocks, and they both wiggle, so there's not really any difference between the CTR stock and the MOE stock as far as I'm concerned. It's not really worth the extra money in my experience. But I did nonetheless get that, and I got it in addition to testing and see whether or not I would actually get the right combination, but I also got it because the pistol brace that was on it was kind of floppy, and in the pistol version, that floppy brace at the bottom kind of made it so that the gun would want to tip downward whenever I went to lean it up against something, and that limited actually how big of a magazine I could have in the gun. This was the biggest size that I could use when it was in its pistol configuration, but now the biggest magazine that I can put in it, and it actually still rests against various things properly, is this one right here. That is one of the Schmeiser ATI quad stack magazines, and that one is double the size of the one that I used to use. And it actually works quite well. It does have to be modified, and I found that with this particular lower, and it seems to be just a problem with this lower, not everybody else's experience this problem, but with this lower, it doesn't take a lot of AK magazines unless you modify them, and the primary modification is on the rear locking lug. There we go. See that the rear locking lug, the bottom part of it, has been rounded by filing, and that's what allows it to fit and function in the gun. I will also note that on these Schmeiser magazines that they don't take all kinds of ammunition well. They usually do just fine with brass case ammunition, and if you have a lacquer-coated steel case where the lacquer is very, very smooth, if it's a really smooth lacquer-coated steel case round, it will do fine. But if it doesn't have a very smooth lacquer on it, and pretty much all steel case rounds have a lacquer on them, a lot of times it's just a very thin layer, and if they don't have a very thick layer of lacquer on there that is not sufficiently smooth, it will cause the magazine to bind up and therefore induce malfunctions. But with the stuff that I have in there right now, this is the Arsenal stuff, and has a nice thick lacquer on there that is very, very, very smooth, and it works just fine with that. All 60 rounds, no hiccups. So yeah, I already talked about the magazine compatibility issue, usually having to file the lug on the back in order to get it to fit. Like I said, I'm not overly impressed with the CTR stock because it doesn't actually lock up and prevent the wiggling that it is supposed to do. You guys will also notice that I put a little bit of black duct tape on the top, and kind of forms a little flap, and that is just so that I don't get my beard hair caught underneath and pinched and plucked and all that kind of stuff. So that's why the tape is on top. And then of course the lower is the same lower that I had used on the pistol when I had that. But of course I don't have that anymore, so now I could put it with this one, and this is of course legally what is considered the gun is the lower. And because of that, in converting this I didn't need to do a separate background check because I already had the gun, legally speaking. So yeah, it is... Oh, and one thing you guys are going to want to know is that Palmetto State Armory finally did get around to fixing the extractor issue, at least as far as I can tell, and that their carrier, we'll see if you can get that in there, you'll see that the carrier has the letters TCE on it, and that is designating that they put an upgraded extractor into the bolt. And so I have not experienced, I've only got like 220 rounds to the gun so far, so this is not an endurance test. But with 220 rounds through it, so far the extractor has not had any problems, but that needs to be qualified by saying that I do have the old pistol buffer system in there. On the pistol, I found out that configuration ran best when I had an H3 buffer in the gun. and I kept that in going to the rifle length version. I did bring a couple other buffers out with me when I was testing this thing, because I thought, well, with the longer barrel, hopefully they didn't keep the gas port at the same size. Hopefully they decrease the gas port size and it won't be as horribly overgassed as the pistol was. That wasn't the case. This thing is still horribly overgassed, and so it still needed the H3 buffer. Like I said, I brought the other ones just in case, but turns out, no, it really needs an H3 buffer. And as far as I know, they're still not selling them with H3 buffers for the KS-47 lowers. So that is something that you'll have to look at it doing yourself. But having learned the lessons from the first one, this version of it, I should say, because technically it's the same gun, but this version of it has actually been going smoothly. Learned the lessons from the previous one. It does have an upgraded extractor in there. I do have spares just in case. And it does have the H3 buffer in it. Another thing that I will note is that the staking on the that PSA originally did not actually hold, and the extension nut basically came loose, and so I had to retighten it down and restake it myself because PSA's staking job, frankly, was not sufficient. So I have it staked here, and then also, of course, have it staked up top. Staking it twice is pretty standard for most AR designs, and so far the staking has held, but like I said, it's only 220 rounds through it, so, not quite as much as I really want to, but, ammunition is money now these days, so it's going to take a while for me to build up to the level with it that I'm really super confident. But so far, as long as it's got a magazine that it likes, like I said, the magazines usually have to be modified by following on the underside of the locking lug. But as long as it has a magazine that it likes, and ammunition that will run in that magazine correctly, and I'm mostly throwing that caveat in there because of the Schmeiser magazines that you have to have fairly smooth ammunition in. But yeah, as long as you have magazines and ammo that don't cause problems, it has been perfectly reliable for me, and no major issues. That's lessons learned from the previous one, and decent enough workmanship in this version to be okay. Is this a gun that I would recommend for everyone? Honestly, not really. I wound up with this one because I already had the gun, legally speaking, or I had the lower, and converting it over was the easiest in terms of legalities, didn't require a separate background check, and the cost difference really wasn't any different. If I would have bought, a sub 2000 or the Smith & Wesson folding 9mm, both of those would have been, the same cost in terms of the upper or more, especially the Smith & Wesson option. And this one has the advantage of being considerably more powerful than any of the 9mm options would have been. So, yeah, that's what I wound up with. And so far it is working just fine. Like I said, I need to get it trued out at distance for the primary arms optic, but yeah, it's doing just fine. Oh, and one last note on the Holosun. Both of these optics actually have kind of a backup, if you will. The primary arms, of course, can be illuminated, but since it's an edge reticle, you don't have to illuminate it, and so that's its backup. If the battery dies, you still have the edge reticle. You still have something that you can work with in that sense. The Holosun has, of course, a solar panel on top, so if the battery dies, as long as you have a decent amount of light, you can still use the red dot. And of course, it's a fairly long-lasting battery. These ones, I think they went to 1632s with, and of course, as long as you carry a spare battery and you change them, usually at least once a year, that's a good rule of thumb, you're usually going to be just fine. And like I said, I have two optics on here, each one having a backup system of their own. The odds that both are going to fail and their backups are going to fail is pretty minimal. Pretty much no matter what, you're going to have some version of an optic that's going to be operable on this setup. So that gives me a little bit of added peace of mind as well. Alright, that, I think, pretty much covers everything, and probably then some. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and ask those down in the comment boxes. That is what that is for some measure of interaction. And hopefully you guys will all have a good one. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind, and the only true Lord of Lords. Amen.